here today to have Professor Alistair Woodward, who's the Head of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Auckland University School of Population Health. And I know he's a keen cyclist, but he also knows a lot about researching in this area, so I think it'll be a very interesting presentation. So there will be time for questions at the end, but over to you, Alistair.
Well, kia ora, thank you very much, Nick. And of course, it's a delight to be here. I know so many people in the audience, and it's like a second home. So wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. We've got a grant from MB to look at the future of the bicycle. Not a lot of money, but it's enabled us to do some interesting things. And we're sort of halfway through the program. So what I'm going to do is talk sort of in loose terms about what we're doing. I'm not going to try and cover everything. I'm going to talk about just what I think are sort of interesting, important aspects to the work and how it fits with the general picture of, you know, the New Zealand transport scheme and where we're heading. And if I talk too much, Nick's going to wave and then he's going to come up and stand beside me, elbow me away from the microphone. And I realize that there are a number of people off-site who are listening, and so thank you to those people who have taken time to listen. And I will try to answer your questions as well if you have them. Well, it's not working. I can, but that's better. That works. Yeah. So I don't know if you knew this, but it's 200 years today, this year, since the bicycle was invented, and there's a museum in Heidelberg, where I took this picture, which has got a model of the first bicycle. And the fellow who designed it lived close to Heidelberg. It's got an interesting story to it. What happened was in 1815, Mount Tambora in the Indonesian archipelago blew up. An enormous eruption. It put so much ash and dust into the air that the temperature of the world, global average temperature, dropped by 2 degrees. And in Europe, there were several very harsh winters with crop failures. And the problem at the time, of course, was that the European transport system relied on the horse. And the horses relied on wheat, on oats and barley, and there wasn't any oats and barley around. So this German engineer devised a machine that would go in place of horse. He called it the pedestrian accelerator. It was also known as the hobby horse. The hobby horse meaning it didn't need to be fed. It was very successful. And the important points you can see, you know, 2 wheels, but the other feature which is very important and you might take for granted is the steering, because in fact you can't balance if you don't have a front wheel that moves. And so this has got, you know, the essential features of the bicycle, really, just lacking pedals and a chain. The design has persisted essentially in this form for 200 years. Motat is going to have an exhibition on the bicycle if you've got a chance to go and see it in Auckland, which I think will be well worth seeing. Now, there's a sort of an irony in it, in a way, that you know, the renewed interest in the bicycle and transport alternatives has come about for not totally dissimilar reasons. You know, that climate change and the interest in human-powered transport as an alternative to machines that have to be fed. It's not grains and, you know, it's not cereal crops that we're feeding our cars, but fossil fuels. And the bicycle still has this enormous potential to not only be an efficient way of getting around, but also environmentally friendly. This is a paper that has just come out in the Journal of Transport and Health, looking at what the consequences might be of ambitious expansion of cycling, walking, and public transport in California. And so it was an exercise looking at what you might achieve in terms of health gain and carbon emission reduction if these transport alternatives were used very widely. And the important point is that of all the alternatives that were explored, it was the expansion of cycling that would convey the greatest health gain in terms of improvement in disability-adjusted life years. And walking also, of course, would bring considerable health benefits. Amongst the different options, looking at the impact on greenhouse emissions, assuming that the active transport substituted for car travel, it was cycling and walking that had the biggest impacts on reductions in greenhouse emissions. And this is shown on the right-hand side of the graph. So the point is that this is a simple technology that we've known about for a very long time. It is extraordinarily efficient in terms of providing a means of getting around. It brings with it considerable benefits, both health and environmental. Are we making use of this or potential technology saver? Well, I guess you could say in patches, we are. You know, things are changing. The picture on the left, of course, is the Pink Path in Auckland, a stretch of motorway that's been repurposed as walking and cycling track. It's a beautiful addition to the city landscape, and it's widely used, so that in the first 4 months after it was opened, there were 100,000 trips up and down the Pink Path. And in parts of Auckland, I'm not sure how it is in Wellington, but certainly in Auckland around the CBD, there are areas where cycle traffic has grown considerably, so that almost 4 times more people entering the city centre via Upper Queen Street on bikes last year than in 2013. About 1 in 10 people coming in via Upper Queen Street are on a bike now. So in some places you can point to significant improvements, but the picture is not so encouraging, I must say, if you look at changes across the country. So this shows from the Household Travel Survey, which, as you'd be aware, is a sort of rolling series of surveys across New Zealand looking at travel behaviour. These are 4-year averages updated year on year, showing the proportion of road-based trip chains under 5 kilometres, which are undertaken by bicycle. The blue line at the top is the national average. And you can see it's, you know, of the order of 2% mode share. So this is short trips, trips that could potentially be undertaken by bicycle. And it's hard to see that 2% figure is growing year on year over this time period. The bottom graph, the red one, is for Auckland, which has the lowest cycling rates in the country. And there you would have to say that it doesn't look good. I mean, if there is a change at all over time, it's a reduction rather than an improvement. So why do we have such promise and yet so far, no strong evidence really that this promise is being put into effect? That's really the question that this research program is interested in. How could we make the future of the bike bright? Well, I think there are some systemic, structural, embedded issues in the transport system that we've really got to grapple with. And I'm going to talk about 3: sprawl, speed, and parking. The sprawl story, again, this has got a very strong Auckland focus, but Chris Harris, who's an historian, has written a really interesting book called Broken City, The Rise of the Motorway and the Fall of Auckland, which is a story about the history of motorways in Auckland and what the consequences have been. And you look at this picture, you know, of the Southern Motorway in Auckland when it opened up. And you think, yeah, you can understand looking at that, you know, why motorways were called freeways. You know, that there's sort of a sense of openness and possibility. You could just drive onto this stretch of road and, you know, in no time at all, you would be away from the awful city and into the beautiful countryside. And of course, that was the whole thing about the motorway system, that it was intended to provide a means of moving people into a rural Arcadia. Despite being a highly urbanized society, New Zealand preferred to view itself as a bountiful Arcadian wilderness where true identity and wealth reside not within the urban realm, but outside the city limits. That's Finlay MacDonald, who was talking to Chris Harris about his book. And I think that the low density and sprawl of New Zealand settlements is, you know, at the heart really of all kinds of challenges that we face in the housing area and certainly in the transport area. The reason being, I don't know whether you would agree with this or be interested in views, but I think that what really matters in terms of how people choose to get around is the proximity of desirable destinations. So, you know, if you're living somewhere where there aren't actually any desirable destinations close by, then does it matter how wide the footpath is? If you're living close to a place you really want to get to, then I'm predicting you will walk, you know, despite the landscape almost. And here's a very personal sort of reflection on this. We've just moved from living in the suburbs in Auckland to an apartment in the, just near the corner of K Road and Ponsonby Road. And so I thought, within a 500-metre radius, you know, how many desirable destinations are there or were there, you know? And in Remuera, within 500 metres of where we lived, there was a dairy and there was a primary school. And otherwise, there wasn't really anywhere I would want to go. Whereas, you know, here's a list of what you find within 500 metres of our apartment. So, you know, how do we get to these destinations? There's absolutely no point in climbing in a car. You know, who would use a car to go to these places? We walk all the time just because it's the obvious and natural thing to do. In fact, there's so much, so close, that I use my bicycle less than I thought I would. Because if the Thirsty Dog, which is the local pub, is 150 metres away, you know, why go on a bike? You sort of hardly unlocked it and could be there on foot. So my point is that because of the history of New Zealand cities and their low density characteristics, I think trying to promote active transport is pushing uphill. That's an image I might return to in a minute. Now the speed story. This is related to, you know, the low density of urban settlements. The picture on the left-hand side is taken in Heidelberg again, where I took the picture of the original bike. And this is my wife Jenny on a bike, which is pretty unusual. She's not at all comfortable about bicycles. Returning from the local market, so, you know, desirable destination close by. And the reason that she was on a bike and felt okay about it was that that entire part of Heidelberg is 30 kilometers per hour, slow speed zone, as much of Europe is, of course. And there's good reason for people to feel more comfortable at slow speeds. The graph here shows the risk of serious injury. This is case it's fatality versus impact speed. And we know very well that the likelihood of a severe crash occurring and severe injury consequent to this is related to the energy transfer, which is the square of the velocity. And so as vehicle speeds rise, risk rises exponentially, and you can see that in these graphs. It's quite hard to die if you're struck by a car at less than 30 kilometers per hour, but your chances of surviving are very small if you're struck by a car traveling at 60 kilometers per hour. Now, so you might think there's good reason then that slow speeds should be wired in to transport decision making. And in fact, in New Zealand, it's the opposite. So here I've got two roundabouts. One of them is a German roundabout, and one of them is a New Zealand roundabout. Which is the New Zealand roundabout? No, it's not the left. So the New Zealand design is on the right. Now, the point being that the New Zealand road design protocol is based on the principle of efficiency. So it used to be solely on the basis of efficiency, in other words, getting vehicles from one side of the city to the other. Safety now, notionally, is part of it, using the safe system approach. But there is still a sense in which safety is weighed up against efficiency. So you make the roads so that they avoid injury, if possible, but you have to balance in all the considerations about people getting around the place. Whereas the German principle is, we're talking here about local streets, not highways, that the first principle is that you do no harm. And so the radial design on the left is a slow speed design, because roundabouts are dangerous places if cars are traveling quickly. The New Zealand design, which is on the right-hand side, is an attempt to provide some sort of safety without slowing down cars too much. Therefore, the shallow angles and the sweeping corners. And we've done a case study of a particular intersection in Auckland where this clash of planning imperatives has played out over the last 10 years. And up until recently, the Council and Auckland Transport have not taken action because they felt that to make the intersection safe would be too much of an inconvenience to all the people in cars who use the route. So here's a problem. You know, if we really want to be serious about unlocking the potential of the bicycle, we're dealing with a very deep set, issue about the New Zealand transport system that in fact is driving the system in a different direction. Now, this is a wonderful book. If any of you have had a chance, have not seen it or don't know about it, then I recommend it to you. The High Cost of Free Parking. It looks at the ways in which free and low-cost parking have determined, to a large extent, urban form and transport choices. Mainly in the United States, is where this guy's from, but it certainly applies elsewhere in New Zealand. In 750 pages, there are only 3 references to the bicycle that I counted, but it's a very important topic for bicycling. The first thing is, Shoup says, free parking is a fertility drug for cars. And of course, it is a very powerful driver of traffic growth. And that's important because it's difficult to have a transport system that is attractive for people on bikes if you've got floods and floods and floods of cars using the system as well. The second point, of course, is that parking is a safety issue for people on bikes. As many of you would know from negotiating arterial roads, if you've got traffic, narrow roads and parked cars, it's a very hazardous and uncomfortable location to be on a bike. And then the third thing that makes parking, I think, really important is that the expectations that go along with a history of largely unconstrained parking. So attempts to reallocate road space to provide for pedestrians and cyclists run into this difficulty of sense of what's right, what's usual, what's I'm entitled to. It's often framed in terms of entitlements. And so not very far from here, I know there have been examples of fierce public reaction to proposals to make roads safer and more generous for cyclists. It's a recurring theme. As part of our program of work, we've been looking at bikelash, because it does seem to me that in order to achieve a sunnier future for the bike, we've really got to understand why it is that people react so vigorously to changes in the public road, and parking is a big part of it. So here's a sort of a snapshot of what we've got to with our bikelash work, which has involved a review of everything we could lay our hands on that's been written about bikelash, and a number of interviews with people across New Zealand who've been involved in instances of road improvements that have attracted fierce opposition. So just quickly, some of the points that have come up. One that you might think is obvious, but it's not necessarily obvious. People are constantly surprised by this. Bike lanes are more than strips of paint. You know, they stand for something. And it's what they stand for which I think explains the very strong reactions to attempts to introduce a new kind of road. It's also interesting to note that the objectors, the people who feel very strongly about this, you know, do fall into different camps. And it may be helpful to bear in mind that people come from slightly different angles. You know, retailers are an obvious group. People who adhere to, who've got sort of certain conservative values. That's what's meant by conservative voters, not necessarily voters for conservative parties, but people who have particular values about what constitutes a good city. Not so much of an issue here, but I think it's emerging. People who see bike lanes as an instrument of gentrification, and to see that as a further sort of diminution of community control. And also, interestingly, cyclists themselves. You know, there's more than one tribe, or there are many clans within the tribe, and there are people ride bikes who feel that bike lanes are, in fact, not going to be helpful for them. We've looked at the ways in which you know, these strong feelings about the alienation of road space as people see it are presented, and suggest that it might be helpful, thinking about a response, to understand why it is that people produce these arguments. They come up time and time again. You know, what people were concerned about at Island Bay is exactly the same as the kind of arguments that have been used in Toronto. And very similar to the sorts of concerns that we've seen recently in London as well. It's interesting to reflect on what we do about that. And so here are some of the responses that people have been talking about in the literature as a possibility if we're going to do a better job in the future. You know, just picking a couple at random there. The argument that we should not be surprised that these things blow up in the media. They will inevitably, even if we think from a sort of professional point of view that there's no basis really to many of these concerns. And where cities have done well, they have typically been extremely proactive with the media and ensuring that major commentators, important commentators, you know, the people who are going to be writing about this, are going to be talking about this on television, know and are well briefed in advance of what's happening. And another argument here, well, two things. The nurture cycle advocates argument. It seems to be where bikelash has been has been, I was going to say, managed, where there's been a good outcome following fierce opposition to change, that's typically occurred where there have been strong cycling advocacy groups who can do things that the local authorities can't necessarily do, but certainly set the tone and direction of argument. And then the last one about consulting early. People talk about this repeatedly, but it's not quite clear what's meant by it. And the next bit of this work program is to follow up the idea of social license. This is something that people talk all the time about here in New Zealand and a bit overseas as well, that we can't really proceed with change of this kind until the authorities and the government are assured that they've got social license to do this. Now, what does that mean exactly, and how would you gain it? And what follows is something that we're interested in pursuing, and I could talk about it subsequently if people want to do that. So, how are we going for time, Nick? Yeah. Obviously, the question of exactly what are the health benefits, health gains from cycling, I mean, that's something that we do need to be certain of before we proceed in this direction. And the concerns about negative health effects of cycling are what dominate a lot of the discussion about cycling. You know, most recently, occupational health and safety issues have been raised. In Auckland, I don't know about here in Wellington, major employers have gone as far as saying we don't want our employees to be travelling by bike because it's too dangerous. It's an unacceptable risk. So being clear about exactly what these risks are and where there may be benefits is terribly important, I believe. This is the latest, largest, and in some ways most interesting study of the health effects of active commuting that's come out. Classic kind of cohort study following up a very large number of people over a period of time. And those people who at baseline were riding a bike to work experienced all-cause mortality over the succeeding years, you know, that was 40% below those who commuted by other means. So this is an extraordinary reduction. It's possibly too large to believe, but the point being that this and other studies have shown the same direction of effect. So if there isn't a risk associated with injury, it's balanced, more than balanced by benefits, and they are substantial. And it's plausible in terms of mechanisms. So the biobank study's been big enough to actually track what happens to people who change their commuting behaviour. And you can see up the top there, they've been able to show that people who change from car travel to active commuting lose weight, and those who change in the other direction put on weight. So makes a causal explanation far more likely. And we, with Louise leading the way, Caroline leading the way, are doing this, a similar kind of analysis here in New Zealand with the census mortality study. Not much done about the distribution of health benefits, a lot done looking at average effects. So this is an area of work that we're looking at as well, taking the standard transport approach to valuing health benefits associated with walking and cycling, but trying to unpick what the differences might be for different age and ethnic groups. This shows here, if we look at walking to begin with for Māori and non-Māori, that the value, the health value per kilometre is not the same for Māori and non-Māori. Now, the explanation for that is that rates of disease that are sensitive to physical activity that could be prevented or reduced in severity by greater physical activity are higher amongst Māori. So they stand to gain more by a shift in terms of transport mode. And the same explains the difference with the age group, where obviously older people have higher rates of diseases that can be modified by physical activity. And so the value for them of walking is greater than for younger people. Cycling, same pattern. The absolute amounts are less. The explanation for that being that cycling is much more efficient than walking, do less work per kilometre, although conceivably more kilometres. I'm going to skip to the last slide because I'm aware that my half hour is almost up. We're interested also in the question of whether the electric bicycle is a game changer. You know, does this provide an opportunity to overcome some of the obstacles that I've been talking about, the sprawl and speed issues, for example, because here's an adaptation to the bicycle that flattens hills, you know, takes away headwinds, shrinks distances. This is a still from the Mercury series of advertisements for electric bike, which some of you may have seen. I think it's been a very effective series of commercials on about the electric bike. And so what we've been doing is talking to people who are current users of electric bikes, talking to people in the bike industry who sell electric bikes, talking to people in the transport sector who are thinking about what electric bikes mean for the transport system in the future. It's very interesting, some of the points that are coming out. People who are using electric bikes frequently talk about the perceived safety benefits. So people feel more comfortable in traffic, and that's largely because it's possible to travel at speeds closer to the speeds of the traffic and to accelerate. And so the differential between the bike and the car is less marked. This is an issue when it comes to regulating electric bikes. How fast should they be able to go? On the one hand, if we upregulated electric bikes so they could travel at 45 kilometers an hour, you know, there would be very little difference between a bike and a car. Another option would be to regulate electric bikes to travel at 30 kilometers an hour and down-regulate the cars. And that might be a more sensible course of action. Expanding active transport radius, people can get more places as a consequence. Interesting comment from a number of people using it that they felt, sure, you get some, you know, electric assist, but it is still a form of exercise, and it's a more inclusive form of exercise. It's one that a number of the women using electric bikes told us they felt, you know, here was an opportunity to get transport as part of their daily routine. Going to a gym or going for a run was a sort of a more less comfortable way of getting exercise than what was provided here. Workplace transport options. This was actually what caused the clash with occupational health and safety that I mentioned. A number of big employers are looking at use of the electric bike to provide options for employees, particularly in settings where there's not much car parking issue. Electric cargo bikes. You know, those of you who've spent time in Europe would be familiar with, you know, how commonly bikes are used as a means of transporting children, transporting goods. It's much more difficult in New Zealand, where the distances are greater, there are hills. Having electric assist means that it's suddenly possible for people who've got to pick up kids from school or who want to use their bikes to transport goods, have got to take things to work. We're interested in the question of mobility for older people, which of course is where the electric bike began in the Netherlands as an opportunity for people who got older but wanted to continue biking, to continue to ride bikes. And here we have potentially a technology that could be used for older people and those with disabilities. So it's an option. In terms of barriers, the point that comes up all the time in discussions is costs. So we're talking about, a piece of equipment that costs maybe several $1,000s. And so if this is going to, in fact, transform the cycling landscape, there needs to be ways of bringing down those costs. And there is talk at the moment about bike share schemes that are based on electric bikes. So Auckland Council is looking very closely at an e-bike share scheme for the CBD. There are entrepreneurs who are talking about bringing in thousands of electric bikes from China and providing them for employers to run workplace bike share programs that are electric. There's schemes opening up where you can lease an e-bike, so you don't need to buy it. You sort of subscribe to a mobility service that will provide a certain number of hours electric biking. Maybe that's going to be the future. So the future of the bicycle, I think, here we have, again, as I say, something that has enormous potential. It's not being utilised, or it is being utilised only patchily. How could we turn that round? That's really the big question, I believe.
So, opening up for questions now. Russell.
You talk about cost of electric bikes. In fact, they're much cheaper than a car. So that if you change from a car to an electric bike, you're saving yourself big time, particularly if you put panels on your roof and charge your bike during the day, as some of us retirees can do. The question I wonder you could answer, what do you say to people who say to me, "Oh, you have an electric bike, that's cheating"?
It's understandable, isn't it? I must admit, I feel that myself. I'm riding around Auckland and somebody sails past going up the hill, and I grit my teeth and dig in and try and get on their wheel, and I just can't, But work's been done looking quite carefully at physical activity and how much people work, and of course it's true that it's like having Lance Armstrong behind you, just giving you a bit of a push. But people still work. The electric bikes, you do enough physical activity to meet guidelines in terms of work done per day. Yeah, that's right. And the other point that people, I don't know whether you would back this up, but people say, we've been talking to, is that even if it's only half the physical activity value per kilometre of being on a bike, I do 3 or 4 times as many kilometres as I would otherwise. So the sort of accumulated credits are considerable and maybe outweigh those of people who are riding ordinary bikes.
My response is no, riding a car is cheap.
Next question.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have 2 comments. One is about the photo you showed about your wife in the 30K zone, about mortality. I noticed that she didn't wear helmet. Actually, helmet might be a very good measure to protect her. And second comment is about the bike sharing scheme you mentioned at the end of the presentation. I think that it started from China, and now the big cities, all the citizens kind of got mobilized. But I remember about a few years ago, cars has become the fashion because that's a social status. If you can drive, that means you are rich. But now, bike sharing schemes have brought the fashion into the young people, that everyone is on a bright color bike and use the app unlock and then lock and then drop the bag anywhere. So I think the bike sharing scheme is a future of the cycling. Yeah. Thank you.
And yeah, thank you. You know, two good points about helmets. Yeah, no, I agree. I think helmets are a good thing. Personally, I'm not in favour of dropping the requirement for helmets in New Zealand. But there is an argument about helmets, you know, to be had. Is that what we should be concentrating on when we think about improving safety? And I think there probably are more important topics. I think the speed thing is probably a more important topic. And of course, in Europe, where cycling is very common and helmet wearing is rare, the cycling injury rates are much less than they are in New Zealand, where cycling is rare and helmets are common. The bike share story is an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, and in China, it's just amazing what's happening at scale. I don't think we've quite worked out, you know, the right model for bike share in New Zealand. And the issue in New Zealand cities is density. I mean, I think where it works well, and there are cities like Lyon, France, Paris, London, where these schemes work well. New York works well. Have typically got high density of work and residential settlement. And so you can have lots of stations close by, or in the center, you know, the new version of the bike share scheme, there are no stations at all. But nevertheless, you can be very confident that you walk out your front door and there'll be a bike close by. That's not true in New Zealand. It would be difficult to provide those conditions.
Yeah, just let you know that just a group of Chinese students actually has started the bike sharing scheme in Wellington earlier this year, but very small scale, only say 50 bikes, pretty much just Oriental Bay to railway station, so flat, no landscape, you know, that comes other than the real purpose of bike and cycling commuting. Yeah, but they are trialing the program. So Auckland flatter, so should be more feasible, I suppose. Yeah.
I've just got a question from Celia Wade Brown online. So both National and Labour have suggested the Auckland Unitary Plan needs to remove metro urban limits. How do we address the myth of urban sprawl helps housing affordability with the huge benefits from walking and cycling?
Goodness, that's a great question, and there are people here in the audience who can answer this more knowledgeably than I can. I'm looking at Philippa in particular. It is such a challenge, isn't it? You know, and I think the idea that the good city is one where people can buy a block of land and put up a house at minimum cost, and other potential alternative high quality settlement options are not available at the same time. That's a major challenge for us walking and cycling as well. Maybe I'll ask Philippa in a minute to comment, but it does seem to me that putting aside the urban-rural boundary issue, focusing on the provision of high-quality, high and medium-density housing, has got to be a priority. And in a sense, the attractiveness of walking and cycling will rise as a consequence of people having more desirable destinations close by. So I'm sort of heartened by what's happening in Auckland, where there is a change in patterns of settlement with infill happening quite quickly, much of it at high quality. Unfortunately, much of it very expensive. I appreciate that. But there are developers like Ockham doing very interesting things, trying to ensure that there's a wider spread of desirable housing close to the city centre. So I haven't answered Celia's question, but I've suggested another way of responding to the challenge.
Thanks, Alistair. That was fantastic as always. I just have a question about e-bikes. We had a French student out who did a little review on economic incentives around biking in Europe, which was great because she could actually read all of these documents that we can't, couldn't access and read. And one of the things that really surprised me about what she came up with was how aggressively subsidised e-bikes are, particularly in France, but probably in other parts of Europe too. There's incredibly generous subsidies for buying e-bikes in multiple cities, almost the whole cost of them in some particular cities. I was wondering whether you thought that kind of policy would be useful in New Zealand or not.
Yes, that's interesting. I didn't realise that the support was so generous. I mean, I was aware of all kinds of incentives and benefits that were provided, including in the tax scheme, which meant that people were getting access to bicycles of all kinds, including electric bikes, at less than cost. It's an interesting question, isn't it? If you weighed up the benefit-cost ratio of tax schemes that provided substantial incentives for people to buy electric bikes, what would be the outcome? My intuition is that it would make a huge difference if you could lower costs even by 50%.
Probably only time for one more question. A comment from Philippa on the urban sprawl and
Yep. You've really answered it, Alistair, except to say our work has shown that people, particularly young people and people whose children have left home, really want to move into the inner city for all the amenities that you've talked about, but want to be able to walk and cycle and take public transport and have things close by. So I like your ordering of your amenities nearby. So I think that's absolutely true. I was going to ask a quick question, if I may, which is the issue you pointed out. One of the reasons that people complain about cycleways is they feel that something is taken away, which of course, as the nudge economist Thala points out, people always value something that's taken away more than something that's given to them. So it seemed to me I guess it's the focus of your research, but the whole thing about the huge amount of money that's being poured into highways of national significance, and they don't have cycleways either as a payoff to the local community or alongside or anything. So there's a lot being given to the car, and so people will get used to that and complain if anything is taken away. So I think we have to address the new expenditure as well as the remediation of cycleways. So I just wondered what you thought about the new versus the old.
Yes, you make a very good point about how people are sensitive to loss or what they perceive as loss, and how to turn that around. I mean, one of the strategies that applies both to new and old investments, perhaps, is to emphasize the gains that everybody experiences as a consequence of better balanced transport systems. And in particular, the benefits that accrue to vulnerable members of the community. So it's, what does this new road design mean for the safety of children? Air pollution, that's right, noise. It's still a challenge, isn't it? I mean, people have said to me about the Island Bay bike lanes, and we've had the same response to many of the new infrastructure in Auckland. They say it just doesn't look right. I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't look right. Even if, in fact, the proportion of the roadway that is available to cars has not been changed at all. It's just that things have been moved around a bit. So I think somehow we've got to respond to this sort of decades of fulfilled expectation, and arising from that a sense of, it is a sense of entitlement.
Well, I'm sure Alistair will be able to take other questions. Oh, okay, one more.
the trip. I've been involved in a number of advocacy things for cyclists around Wellington. The pattern that we see, and Island Bay's sort of an example, but it keeps being repeated, that everywhere you seek to establish better cycling infrastructure, it's a new ball game again, because you have intense local reaction, often opposition that is very focal. You have diffuse benefit. And so in the political economy of what's happening, you know, a council's got to have cast iron to proceed. But I'm involved in a cycleway that's attempting to build from Hutt into Wellington, where we traverse 3 different territorial authorities and Kiwi Rail and Transport Agency and umpteen shopping precincts, and we seem to be renegotiating the ground rules every 100 yards, and that seems to be an insurmountable objective. So how do we reframe the debate in a way that we don't get, you know, stuck every 100 yards?
Yeah, well, this is where we're exploring this idea of social license, because maybe if we're carrying out consultations, you know, once we've decided that there's going to be a cycleway from the hut to the city, it's in a sense it's too late, because you inevitably provoke that question about what happens outside my shop, sort of response. Whereas, is it possible to prime? Is it possible to work in advance of specific infrastructure change in a way that changes, you know, attitudes generally, raises awareness, sort of reframes the issue? You know, a lot of it is about framing, I think. Is this about building a city that's safe for an 8-year-old? Is it about building a city that's safe for somebody who's 85 who wants to get from one side of the road to the other? Is it about building a city that's quiet and people are not poisoned by the pollution? Is it about building a city that is fit for purpose in an age of climate change? You know, trying to reposition the starting points. This is just an idea. I don't know whether it's what can be achieved, because it's so common, the experience that you describe. If, you know, and councils are sort of been surprised all the time. They say, oh, I thought we sorted that out ages ago, you know. And yet here we are in Takapuna, you know, and we just want to provide a space in the central shopping area where it's safe for people to walk around, you know. And all of a sudden people are bringing up these arguments about, you know, I'll go out of business if people can't park directly outside the shop, you know. So I don't know the answer to your question. You know, it'd be interesting to hear from Celia and from others who've been in the front line about what they think. But my sense is that we've got to try and get ahead of the wave.
So, great answer, and I'm sure Alistair's happy to take other questions if you wanted to come down, but I'd like you to thank you for a great presentation.